It's one of the most iconic fighters of all time, but how good was the Spitfire really? This is its full and turbulent story, from the Battle of Britain in its darkest hour all the way to the Pacific and the carrier battles against Japanese Zeros. Let's set the stage. In the summer of 1940, Britain was looking straight at what felt like an inevitable invasion of its own mainland. Nazi Germany had just swept through most of Western Europe in a matter of weeks. Then came France, which fell faster than anyone in Britain had thought possible. What followed was one of the most desperate retreats in modern history. Hundreds of thousands of British and Allied troops were evacuated from Dunkirk in a chaotic operation where the British Army left behind most of its military equipment. It had narrowly escaped complete destruction, but it was now nearly disarmed. Now Britain had to prepare for what looked like a looming German invasion, and they didn't have much time. The Royal Air Force, already stretched thin, was scrambling to recover from the losses in France. And to make things worse, many of the planes they had seemed completely outclassed by the German Luftwaffe. German Messerschmitt Bf 109s were fast, well-armed and battle-tested at the time. British pilots, on the other hand, were flying older Gloster Gladiator biplanes and the more modern Hawker Hurricane, which was sturdy and reliable, but slower and less agile than its opponents. And then there was the Spitfire. At first, the British were hesitant to risk their newest and most advanced fighter in the chaos of early battles like the fall of France, so it was the older Hawker Hurricanes that went first. But when the Luftwaffe turned its full attention to Britain in the summer of 1940, there was no holding back anymore. The Spitfires would now be fully deployed, and they were about to prove themselves in one of the most legendary air campaigns in history. As the Luftwaffe launched wave after wave of air raids, first targeting radar stations and airfields, then factories, and eventually cities, Britain's survival came down to what could be kept flying and fighting. The RAF, battered and under constant pressure, began throwing everything it had into the skies. The Spitfire now stepped into the spotlight. It was fast, it was agile, and it gave British pilots the first real chance at going head-to-head with the Luftwaffe's best. The Battle of Britain was raging, and the Spitfire was at the center of it. But it was far from easy or simple. The design was advanced, the construction complex, and the British production system wasn't ready for it. Promises of 5 Spitfires a week didn't happen. In fact, the delays were so bad that by the time the war began in September 1939, only a few squadrons had Spitfires at all. But what really made the Spitfire so special, and how did it stack up throughout the entire war? Let's first cover the Spitfire's armament. 8 .303 caliber Browning machine guns were intended to be its main weapon. However, due to supply shortages, many early Spitfires had only 4 installed, and the rest were added later as production caught up. But even with the full 8 guns, a couple of problems began to show immediately. The RAF's version of the Browning had been modified to fire from an open bolt. This was done to prevent accidental ignition from heat buildup when firing ammunition that used cordite propellant. However, at the high altitudes where the air was -30°C, it rushed through the barrel and the open bolt, freezing the internal components. This caused the guns to fail during combat. The problem was eventually solved when supermarine engineers routed hot air from the engine's radiator ducts directly into the gun bays. To protect the barrels from dirt and moisture, red fabric patches were doped over the gun ports. These patches were blown off the moment the guns were fired, a simple but effective method of keeping them clean before the fight. Now, the next issue. Even with all 8 machine guns fully operational, pilots were still struggling to bring enemy aircraft down efficiently. Statistics showed that on average, 4,500 rounds were needed to shoot down a single plane. To make matters worse, the Spitfire could only carry around 350 rounds per gun, giving the pilot just about 15 seconds of fire before running out. Another problem was the low caliber itself. The .303 caliber lacked the destructive force needed to reliably disable enemy fighters or bombers. American aircraft, by comparison, used .50 caliber guns, which were significantly more effective. But even beyond that, there was a problem known as dispersion. Because the guns were spread across the wings, even when perfectly aimed, the bullets didn't all strike the same point. At just 100 meters, the shot pattern was already too wide, meaning that even well-aimed bursts might only land a few hits. And if those hits didn't strike vital systems, the enemy aircraft remained in the fight. It became clear that RAF fighters would soon need heavier weapons. Trials were already underway to arm the Spitfire with 20mm Hispano cannons, but early prototypes had to mount the cannons sideways inside the wings, using drum magazines that limited capacity and required large blisters on the wing surfaces. These created aerodynamic issues and cost the aircraft precious speed. On top of that, the cannons constantly jammed. Eventually, a new feed mechanism solved many of the problems, and the 20mm Hispano became a reliable part of the Spitfire's evolving armament. It was usually paired with 4 303s or, in later variants, with 250 caliber guns. The Spitfire's airframe was constantly being pushed to its limit, trying to solve one problem after another. But through trial, error, and hard-won frontline experience, the Spitfire gradually transformed into a fighter capable of dealing with faster, heavier, and more dangerous aircraft, although it was far from easy. The aircraft's famous elliptical wing gave it both reduced drag and better lift, which helped the Spitfire turn tighter than most opponents. It was powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Early versions provided over 1,000 horsepower, with later marks pushing above 1,400. That gave the Spitfire a top speed of about 370 miles per hour, which was fast enough to keep pace with the best fighters of the era. The engine also had a unique growl that became part of its legend, but despite all this, there were still problems. While the German Bf 109 used fuel injection, giving it a reliable fuel flow even under negative G-forces, the British Merlin engine in the Spitfire still ran on a carburetor system. Now that sounds like a disadvantage, and in many ways it was, but it was also a calculated trade-off. By feeding fuel in before the supercharger, it caused evaporation, which in turn cooled the intake air by about 25 degrees Celsius. That cooler air made the supercharger more efficient, directly boosting engine power, especially at higher altitudes. In practice, that gave the Merlin a noticeable performance edge when climbing or cruising at elevation. But here's the catch. During hard maneuvering, especially in a steep dive, the Merlin's carburetor couldn't handle negative Gs. The fuel would either flood the engine or cut out completely. German pilots had no such issue, and they quickly learned how to escape the Spitfire. They could simply dive away. If a Spitfire pilot tried the same thing, the engine would sputter or stall completely. They later learned to do a half roll first, then dive, flipping their aircraft upside down to keep positive Gs on the fuel line. Eventually, a solution came from a technical officer named Beatrice Tilly Schilling. Her fix was a small metal washer installed in the fuel line. This restricted the fuel flow just enough to prevent the carburetor from being overwhelmed during negative G maneuvers. It didn't fix everything, but it was a lifesaver. It kept Spitfires in the fight until proper pressure carburetors were eventually introduced in 1943. The Spitfire's first major opponent was the Messerschmitt Bf 109. In many ways, this was the Spitfire's equal. In some technical aspects, the 109 even had the edge, especially at higher altitudes and in climbs. But once over British airspace, German fighters had only about 10 minutes of fuel for dogfights before they had to turn back across the channel, and that made all the difference. German bombers needed escort, and the 109s could provide it only briefly. British radar gave early warning, and Spitfire squadrons scrambled to meet the enemy in the sky, knowing exactly where they were. While the slower Hurricanes focused on the bombers, the Spitfires would attack the escorting fighters in ferocious dogfights. Later, when the Germans began launching V-1 flying bombs, Spitfires were again scrambling to intercept and down them before they reached the cities. One quite terrifying tactic came into play when a pilot ran out of ammo and couldn't bring the rocket down. Knowing it would hit a civilian area, the Spitfire pilot would carefully edge their wingtip beneath the V-1's wing and gently tip it. This would throw off the rocket's gyroscope and send it crashing out of the sky. By the end of the 4-month campaign, the Luftwaffe had lost over 1,700 aircraft, including many of its best fighter pilots. Britain lost about 1,250, but crucially, it held the line. Hitler's plans for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, were postponed and eventually abandoned. For participating in saving its country, the Spitfire became a national symbol, but its war was only just beginning, and it was going to be progressively more wild. By 1941, the Luftwaffe wasn't gone, far from it. The German Air Force remained strong, especially over continental Europe. The Allies were now beginning to take the fight across the Channel, and this meant escorting bombers, attacking enemy targets in France and beyond, and flying in environments far different from what the Spitfire had been originally built for. So the upgrades began. Later marks of the Spitfire received boosted Merlin variants with more horsepower, better superchargers, and much improved high-altitude performance. Eventually, the Merlin would be replaced in the top-end variants with the Rolls-Royce Griffon engine. The Griffon produced well over 2,000 horsepower, pushing the Spitfire into a new performance bracket entirely. As the war moved into new theaters, the need for carrier-based aircraft increased, and so the Seafire was born, a navalized version of the Spitfire. This might sound simple, but it was actually a tricky conversion. The Spitfire had narrow landing gear, which made already dangerous carrier landings, let's say, adventurous. It also had a long nose, which limited visibility on approach. The first Seafires were essentially standard Spitfires with some naval tweaks. An arrestor hook for carrier landings, catapult spools, strengthened landing gear, and later, folding wings. However, the Spitfire's narrow undercarriage and relatively fragile airframe were never really suited to the punishing conditions of deck landings. As a result, Seafires had a reputation for, to say the least, being a bit tricky to land on carriers, especially in rough seas. Still, it gave the Royal Navy a fast, high-performance fighter when they needed one the most. In North Africa and the Mediterranean, the Spitfire found itself up against Italian and German fighters above the desert. After D-Day, they flew tactical missions over Normandy, performed armed reconnaissance, attacked ground targets, and encountered new Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, which were a much tougher opponent now. But one of the most interesting chapters of the Spitfire's journey came when it was deployed to the Pacific and Southeast Asia, facing a completely different kind of enemy, the Japanese Zero. The Zero was incredibly light, agile, and deadly at low speeds, especially in close-quarters dogfights. Spitfires had to adjust their tactics. British and Commonwealth pilots learned to avoid turning battles with the Zero, and they learned that because everyone who tried it usually died. Instead, they would use the Spitfire's superior diving power and speed. They would engage the Zero only when conditions were in their advantage, using hit-and-run tactics to decimate the light, unarmored Japanese aircraft. By the end of the war, the Spitfire had been adapted into more than 24 variants. It was one of the few fighters that stayed in production before, during, and after the war, and its final versions could still match or outperform many newer designs. So, how good was the Spitfire really? Well, good enough to help save Britain, fight across the world, and keep flying long after the war it was built for had ended. If you found this video interesting, check out our other videos on World War II fighter aircraft.